Okay, hello everyone. Welcome. Publics and Counterpublics. We divide this lecture into two separate lectures because normally there's a lot to cover. I am going to divide it up still, but like it probably won't be nearly as long as it would be if we were actually in class, which is unfortunate. Quick housekeeping issues. People are starting to work on their group stuff. That's great. Some people who have dropped off for a little bit, like I've kind of sent out emails to make sure if you are in a group and still have people who have not contacted you or have not messaged the group or anything like that, you need to let me know so that I can put them on call or whatever and see what we can do. The other stuff is quizzes. Quizzes. Time kind of lost all of its meaning lately. So yeah, I'm going to put up the quizzes over the weekend for the last two chapters. I'm also going to make that due date like really long because I know that you've got a lot of other things to do right now too. And I don't want you to be super uptight about these quizzes. Just don't forget about them. I'm still making my way through the discussion board posts. There were a lot of really good discussion board posts on there. And I wish I could just talk to each of you individually and be like, hey, that's really interesting. Or, hey, maybe we should revise this. But such is life under the corona plague. At any rate, let's talk about publics and counterpublics. The chapter opens up with a very good, I'm going to share my screen. Opens up with a really good conversation about like immigration protests and things like that. And they talk about quite a few different items that are going on within those protests. One of them is like they do define what a public is, okay? So like a public is formed by people coming together to discuss common concerns, including concerns about who they are and what they should do, and as a result, constructing social reality together, all right? So like when we are saying publics and counterpublics, we are saying that like a group of people are a public, right? We're saying public as a noun, not as an adjective. Okay, so it's a group of people is a public, right? That are coming together to discuss common concerns, yada yada yada, right? While being out in public is something different. That's not what we'll be talking about in regard to this chapter. Okay, when we're talking about publics and counterpublics, we're talking about groups of people coming to decisions. Often in electoral politics, this will be talked about a lot. Right, but also ways that we enact citizenship and things like that. So that's an issue. That's what we'll be talking about. Oh, last housekeeping thing also is like Bitzer is due today. So you need to get that in to your group leaders so that they can grade it for me, all right? We'll have one more annotation after this. It's Warner. The group who is doing the Counterpublics as their group assignment, pay special attention to the Warner article, all right? It's long. All right, I'm going to warn everyone right now. It's long, all right, but it's also super relevant to you because we have like 3 different scholars when it comes to publics and counterpublics with 3 very different views of how publics are constituted and created. And so like I would expect to see all 3 of those scholars in your reading list for this literature review, all right? And but let's move on, okay? So they talk about like this idea of like publics, all right, and like our understanding of the role that rhetoric plays in them, right? Rhetoric constitutes publics. It is a way that like rhetoric helps to create publics and form them into being, right? And publics argue or talk or like give speeches in the civic realm, right? They do this like publics are something that like are open to people, or at least according to Habermas. Habermas? Who's Habermas? This is Habermas, Jürgen Habermas, one of the best names in all of rhetoric, but no. Also, German scholar, what is a public? Like, he has his definition, okay? And he calls his idea of what we would call the public sphere, all right? For him, it's a social life where a public opinion can be formed. It can be constituted in every conversation where private persons come together to form a public. All right. So like what this means is like it's people coming together, right? The thing about Habermas's public is like it's an idealized form of public sphere, right? Like this is what a public should be according to Habermas. People coming together where anyone can come together and discuss common concerns that have to do with the issues of the day, right? So they construct a social reality. So what that means is like when a public gets together and they get this like unified idea of like what is going on in the world, then they construct their own reality. Like they believe they create this like unified shared fantasy almost, but it's not a fantasy. It is reality. It is just like how they view reality, right? It's how they feel that they interact with the world. It's ontology, right? And like that is a part of the public, right? And so for Habermas, he says that like this idea of like publics coming together to discuss common concerns to affect like larger governments and things like that started in salons and coffee houses in what, the 17th century. And like this is what one would look like quite a rousing party, as you can see. But you also notice that like everyone of all kinds of different backgrounds are together to discuss issues, right? That discussion being open is a very important characteristic to the public sphere for Habermas, right? He contrasts it with the private sphere, which are like the affairs of the home, right? Which is like where a private sphere type of discourse might happen, while the public sphere is where the bourgeoisie get together to speak on issues of the day in order to affect change by to affect change higher up in the court, in the royal court, right? The aristocrats get together and start to like form policies and ideas and things on their own. This is a unique thing in this time because like before this time, before there was a bourgeoisie and aristocracy, like it was just all the king. The king was like, yeah, you should do this. And like, then people would do that, right? Instead, people are coming to formulate their own ideas. And that's a unique thing that Habermas is like, yo, like this is important. This is the formation of the public sphere, okay? There are three characteristics that have to be a part of the public sphere. Well, first, the publics are constituted by rhetoric. Rhetoric creates them. But the three items that are necessary for a public sphere to be effective, to actually work, is that it has to be open to all citizens, right? You can't have a public sphere and then just say, oh no, this group of people can't be a part of it, right? Then it's no longer a public sphere. Then it's like a group that like is exclusionary. It has to address matters of general interest, right? So like you wouldn't, if you could have like a group of people that are addressing something, but if they're like just talking about Star Trek Picard, right? Like, I mean, like it's my general interest, but it probably isn't like the general public's general interest, right? It doesn't really affect everyone. And lastly, it has to be free from coercion. If you are coerced into like stating an opinion that you don't believe in, then like that's defeats the purpose of the public sphere, right? It doesn't function that way. It doesn't work. Like if you can maintain all of those items on there, then you have a great public sphere. You have a functioning democracy. You have really good like type of like civic life where everyone feels represented and everyone like gets to like you know, be part of the way that they govern. So again, like don't conflate public with public sphere, like don't conflate the public of being out in public, right? Or don't conflate the public as in like public assistance, meaning that it's like something that the government does, right? No, the public sphere is about like literally just groups of people. And it doesn't have to be like a part of the government. So like, I know that this is like going to be like really easy to get mixed up because there's many different meanings of public. In this case, we're talking about groups of people. Okay, so moving on, we get into strong and weak publics. What's the difference between a strong and weak public? It's pretty self-explanatory, actually. Strong publics and weak publics both form opinions, but like strong publics have the power to make decisions, right? So Congress would be a strong public, right? Because like they're having opinion formation, they have decision-making power, and they also are like able to talk freely amongst each other, like for the most part. And like they can like create decisions that have effects on other people. Weak publics have opinion formation still, right? But they don't have decision making power. Now, does this mean that weak publics can't do anything? No, that does not mean that at all. Weak publics are like all of us, right? We're all parts of the weak public, but and like through our getting together and speaking about issues and things like that, we can form opinions and they become predominant opinions, and then that can bubble up towards higher sections of our governance in order to have that decision-making power happen later. Now, a great example of weak publics influencing strong publics along the way and like making real world change would be marriage equality, right? Through an amazingly fast, relatively speaking, turn of public opinion on the idea of like marriage equality. There was pressure exerted by weak publics upon strong publics to the point where the Supreme Court, feeling that pressure, right? And like, don't think the Supreme Court is like doesn't feel public pressure. They very much feel public pressure. Like through that pressure, they changed the law and they said like, yeah, like marriage equality is a thing. And so same-sex marriage should be allowed across the country, and we're just going to make it so. So the strong public of the Supreme Court that has the decision-making power influenced by weak publics, right? So this happens like all kinds of different ways all the time. Okay. Yes. Move on here. Hybrid publics. So as a member of publics, like we carry like multiple different like positions or identities within like these types of publics, or people can like see us in different ways inside of a certain public, right? So our identity is like one way that like we think about ourselves, right? But we can also think of ourselves as like a legal patron, right? So like I am Craig. I'm a white guy who is cis and all that other stuff. I was a person who lived in a city, right? Who came from Detroit. And as a person from Detroit, my identity influences how I'm seen, right? So I can be seen as a newcomer to the city. I can be seen as a resident to the city. I can be seen as a gentrifier to the city, right? All have different implications. Someone who could be considered an owner of a business can be considered an owner, a job creator, a boss, or a capitalist, right? All different aspects of like their personal identity, right? And like that oh, excuse me for just 1 second here. Sorry, I have to pause for just a second. Okay, we're back. Going back to this hybrid publics, right? So the idea is that you can be a member of these, you can be thinking about like our governance and the law, and like also still carry identities, and they're not mutually exclusive of each other. They can happen at the same time. Slideshow from current slide. There we go. We have this like idea of like who we are as our identities, and then like who we are as a citizen, and like these groups of publics can all be differently identified and still have influence on the law and like the legal aspects of governance, right? So like the newcomer, resident, and gentrifier all have reinforced how we enact urban policies, right? They all have an influence in like their own shared reality on like how we do that. All of those people below that, the owner, job creator, boss, capitalist, all have influences on labor policies and business policies, right? But they don't like take away their identity of who they are just to be a part of like an amorphous public where everyone doesn't have their identity. The public doesn't strip away their identities of who they are, right? The influence of how we see ourselves as a class subject has an influence on how we create tax brackets and who the top 1% is and things like that. Influence how we see our identity as a worker or as young or as old. It has an influence legally in like things like social security benefits, right? In our nation, we have a respect or like a desire to protect the elderly and to care for them. And so as a result, we create things like the Social Security program in order to ensure that like they have some type of a benefit for their end of life, right? Um, I like, yeah, we still have a desire to care for the elderly, no matter how many times people say, "Okay, boomer." Anyhow, hybrid publics means that like you don't have to take away like there can be multiple different publics that are also all influencing the law and all in their own different ways. That's concept comes up from Nancy Fraser, who is someone that if you're doing counterpublics, you should read. Okay, counterpublics. Counterpublics. So public discourse, right? The acceptable public discourse, the mainstream public discourse, right? That is the public. The counterpublic is a subversive notion, right? It's the idea of like a group of people getting together to talk about things that is against the mainstream, that is like against like what the conventional wisdom would suggest, okay? Nancy Fraser talks about them too. So counterpublics, Fraser defines as parallel discursive arenas where members of subordinated social groups invent and circulate counter discourse to formulate oppositional interpretations of their identities, interests, and needs. And we see this a lot in a lot of different aspects, right? We see like a really good example that's going on my Twitter feed right now, or on my Instagram feed right now, is like the resistance to the organization Autism Speaks, okay? Autism Speaks is an organization that was founded by a person whose daughter, I believe, was autistic, and they wanted to search for a cure, and they view autism as a scourge, as a like problem. So that is like the public discourse where they're like, yeah, we want to spend money to find a cure because like autism, like we're like, it's outside of the norm. So like we're some parents struggle with it, right? And like yeah, I'm just gonna leave that there. So the counter discourse becomes like, no, wait, like why would you try and cure us, right? Because like I'm pretty happy with who I am, so I don't think I need to be cured because there's nothing really wrong with me, okay? So that's one example. Like you see this also in the deaf community, right? With cochlear implants, right? Cochlear implants are these things that can attach to like your brain, I guess, or your ears, and ear nerves, audio nerves, and like it allows people who cannot hear to hear. And while at first this was like a really great medical breakthrough and everyone's like, oh, sweet, we don't have to have deafness anymore, a lot of people who are non-hearing in the deaf culture were very like afraid by that and saying like, well, if you just eradicate like our entire culture, then how is that not a form of genocide, right? Because like everything that we've come to know as deaf people is like just taken away. And because we know through prior chapters about language and the influence that language has upon how we think, then like by taking away the need for sign language, you are taking away like how people think and replacing it with something else. So cochlear implants are very controversial in the deaf community because of this, right? And the resistance to it is a counter-public discourse, right? Because it is like the deaf community saying like, hey, like this is not right, right? You can see in my example here, public discourse, who is that guy on the left? That is McCarthy, McCarthyism, right? The senator who would say, in my hands, I have the paper with the names of 500 communists working in Hollywood right now, right? Counter-public discourse is this meme, right? What's missing in your life? Yes. So it is against the prevailing discourse about like the need or the prevailing discourse about an ideology of capitalism, right? Would be like that type of discourse would be a counter-public discourse. Now, counterpublics can take a couple of different forms. They can be enclaved or oscillating, all right? An enclave counterpublic doesn't show their plans to people, all right? It's concealing their strategies. They plan, right? They can internally within that counterpublic, they can have debates and like planning and like and discussions, right? But they're not going to like just like engage in the larger public sphere. Uh, they're not going to engage in like a mainstream public sphere to present their strategies, right? So like a lot of people who are like in an enclave counterpublic are people who are just like either uh, either have like risks of that would be taken, the excessive risks in like revealing themselves as a part of this counterpublic, or maybe they're just like exasperated and don't really want to engage with the broader groups of people because of like the nature of their counterpublic. Oscillating publics are publics that exist to engage in debate with outsiders, right? They talk back to dominant discourses. These are the people who are the proverbial shit stirrers of the world, right? The ones who get out there and like start to question the things that we already like have like begun to accept as true, okay? This is where change happens very often. So oscillating publics in that sense, like go out and engage in that debate, right? Enclave publics are not always just like hyper criminalized types of people, like anti-fascist movements and things like that. It's also like an enclave public can be the academic community in a lot of ways, right? There was a thing called ClimateGate quite a few years back where some right-winger people, anti-climate people, I'm sorry, I don't know if they were right-wing or not. They were just anti-climate people. And they said that they were blowing the hole open on the climate debate, saying that these scientists are tricking people and everything like that. And there was no response from the academic community for quite a while. Why? Because like a lot of academics don't feel that it's their mission to bring their work out to the public, or out to people, to lay people. They feel like their work and their writing is for other academics alone. And like, so to make it, to engage with these people who are like trying to undermine them would denigrate themselves and like make them like less worthy or less of a lower status, right? So they felt they were above that. But like as climate skepticism grows, they said like, oh well, I guess we do need kind of a PR type of arm to like have that oscillating public to engage in debate with these outsiders and things like that, to talk back to those discourses where now I guess we could say the climate skeptic discourse is the counterpublic in this case. But yeah, like without that, if you remain enclave, like there can be like, while it may be protective of your counterpublic, it can also run the risk of like never being relevant. So those are the differences between enclaved and oscillating publics. Identity as a public is the last section that I want to talk about today. How can identity be a public or a counterpublic? Well, let's take a look at the Google of typical American family and see what comes up. All right, look at the first two pictures here. We see a very white, very straight, with the two kids, a boy and a girl, who are very like cis looking, right? Like not really like showing any type of like gender bending or anything like that. That is like what it means to be a public as an identity, right? And a counterpublic as an identity would show different types of families, right? Different types of typical American families, right? We see this Muslim family here, right? We see this African American family here, right? We see like this group that's a family, and they are like all very diverse, very, very diverse, right? And so like, and this like looks like an interracial family over here, right? So like this is how you become a counterpublic through, this is one way that you become a counterpublic through like what your identity is. Also like your identity, like you can like, counterpublics will define themselves in the counter type of way. They talk about the activist group ACT UP in here. I highly recommend reading this. ACT UP did a lot of work in like fighting for HIV/AIDS research in the 80s, and they did a lot of very provocative and interesting types of like protest actions in order to do that. And they became a very prominent counterpublic that allowed for a lot of change to happen in the real world to fight against HIV/AIDS. So that's all that I want to talk about for today. This is a short video, I know. Please continue to work on your groups. Please continue to do what you do so well, and I will see you soon.